Good evening. I'm Bradley Graham, co-owner of Politics and Prose, along with my wife Lissa. And on behalf of the entire staff, I'd like to welcome you here. We're very fortunate to have with us this evening a writer who, in her work and her life, has been at the intersection of North and South America, North and South American cultures. Marie Arana really has exemplified biculturalism. Her husband, the literary critic Jonathan Yardley, who's here somewhere, Jonathan, has written that Marie is a true citizen of this hemisphere. And I think that's a very apt description. Born in Lima to a Peruvian father and a North American mother, Marie has continued to hold dual citizenship in Peru and the United States and has residences in both countries. And her writing, which has been in English, has sought to explore and explain both cultures, whether it was her memoir about her bicultural childhood, American Chica, Two Worlds, One Childhood, which was a finalist for the 2001 National Book Award, or her two novels, Cellophane about the Peruvian Amazon, or Lima Nights. The other defining aspect to Marie's literary career, in addition to her bicultural perspective, has been her professional involvement in promoting and critiquing the works of others. In fact, she got her start in book publishing, becoming a senior executive at both Harcourt Brace and Simon & Schuster in New York. Then in 1993, she ventured into journalism as deputy editor of the Washington Post book review section, eventually becoming head of that section, a position that she held for 10 years. Currently, she's a writer at large for the Post and a senior advisor to the Librarian of Congress, and she sits on the board of the National Book Festival. She's also edited a collection of Washington Post essays about the writer's craft, titled The Writing Life, How Writers Think and Work, which was published about a decade ago and is used as a textbook for writing courses in a number of universities. Marie's new book, Bolivar, American Liberator, comes in the wake of no small number of books about the Venezuelan revolutionary. She notes in the acknowledgments that the Library of Congress alone has 2,683 volumes about Simón Bolívar. But most are in Spanish. Many are in Bolivar's words or written by contemporaries of his, and many more are very biased one way or the other about the controversial leader. So Marie has done a great service providing not only a balanced, well-researched account, but one that's in English and a wonderfully fluid, vivid English at that. Marie has a personal connection to Bolivar. Her ancestors fought on opposite sides from each other at the Battle of Ayacucho, which won Peru independence from Spain. As she explained in a recent interview, she heard a lot about that battle as she was growing up, and Bolivar became for her a symbol of the South American personality, its dreams, hopes, ambitions, and energy, as well as its flaws. Marie plans to speak for a bit, and then we'll certainly leave time for questions. If you have a question, please use one of the microphones here. As you see, we're well covered tonight with cameras everywhere. We have C-SPAN over there and our own videoing operation over there and over there. So it really is helpful if you could ask your question in the microphone, but if you can't make it to the microphone, just raise your hand and we can repeat the question up here. And then afterwards, Marie will be delighted to stay and sign copies of her book, which are available at the cash registers up front. So if you haven't already, please silence your cell phones and join me in welcoming Marie Arana.
Thank you, Brad. What a nice introduction. I love politics and prose, as so many of you do. This is probably one of the great literary institutions, certainly of Washington, if not of the whole country. I have loved it a long time, since Carla Cohen was here and Barbara Mead, and now under the aegis and the leadership of Brad Graham and Lissa Muscatine, I'm so happy to see that it's just thriving and supporting not only writers like me, but readers like you. And it's a pleasure to see it sort of humming. So thank you for asking me to come here. I see so many friends in the audience that I'm just going to pretend that I'm sitting by my fireplace at home with John and talking a little bit about this book. It's such a was such a pleasure to work on. And people find that hard to believe because it's not an easy thing, writing a biography of a very famous leader on which everybody has an opinion, and on whom so much has been written already. It is true that there are 2,683 books in the Library of Congress on Simón Bolívar. I would say 90% of those are in Spanish, so I'm lucky there. But this is an extraordinary life, and a life that was lived in the largest sense. I mean, a canvas that is huge, stretches through most of South America, and a life lived large in other ways as well. Simón Bolívar was very dramatic and commanding personality. He was called Iron Ass by his soldiers because he rode 75,000 miles to liberate the 6 countries that he liberated. It's really an extraordinary physical feat, if nothing else. But he also was a man of the Enlightenment, someone who had been inspired at the youngest age by reading Voltaire and Montesquieu and John Locke, and came out of that experience actually probably at about 2021 with a very passionate sense of his country, the colonial yoke that it suffered under, at least he felt it suffered under. And he was all for liberty and freedom, greatly admired the United States, greatly admired in many respects Napoleon, although there were aspects of his of the empire, the Napoleonic Empire, that he did not admire. But this was a man also of flesh and blood. He was a great womanizer. He had 35 mistresses, 37, I guess it was, 37 mistresses that we can count. After his wife, who was greatly beloved to him, died, he was 19 years old when she died, and he went on to pledge that he would never marry again, but that didn't mean that he wasn't going to have a good time, and he did. He was a great dancer, loved music, said that he did his best thinking really on the dance floor, and whereas others needed to be away from the hubbub of life in order to get things thought through, he felt that a ballroom with lots of pretty women and lots of polkas and dancing was just the perfect place to think through the Gordian knots that he encountered. And he would go back in the middle of a dance, all sort of happy and elated and sweating in the middle of it, go back to a back room and dictate 3 letters at a time to 3 different secretaries, and then go back to the ballroom again and think some more on his feet, literally. I'm often asked, why did you choose to write about Simón Bolívar? And I have to say that in my whole career, as a writer, I've had a long career as an editor for a long time, but as a writer, my whole career, I would say, has been to try to explain Latin America and Latin Americans to North Americans and to English speakers. It's not an easy task because there are great differences and great divides of personality, heart, between North Americans and South Americans. But every single book that I've written has been another brick I always say, in the edifice of trying to explain who we are and how different we may think from North Americans. Of course, you may say, as a bicultural person, and I see many faces whom I know out there who are bicultural, you also know that you're thinking with two heads and feeling with two hearts when you're living between cultures. And I wanted to get a sense of that other side, the Latin American side, which is so different, and its history is so different, to North American English readers. So, and Brad is right that I had always been captivated as a child by the Battle of Ayacucho. I was not a very well-behaved child. And I was very often dragged by my collar to sit in my grandparents' living room, which was dark and airless and sort of filled with, frightening busts and porcelains and things like that, and old musty books. And I was made to sit there in that dark sort of chamber to contemplate my badness. And it was on a hard, I remember it as being on a hard stool, although my aunt and godmother, who is now 83, bless her heart, tells me that it was hardly a hard stool. It was a big, soft, plushy, cushioned chair. So I'm not sure about memory there, but it felt like a hard chair. And I was made to look at the portraits that surrounded me. And one portrait to my right was, portrait to my left was Joaquin Rubin de Celis, who was my great-great-great-grandfather. And he had fought at the Battle of Ayacucho. He was a Spanish brigadier general. And he was the first Spaniard to charge, and he was the first Spaniard to fall. And he was killed with a sword to his heart right away at the very beginning of the battle. He was on the left. On the right was a portrait of a very wan, wistful, beautiful young woman whose name was Trinidad Rubin de Celis. And she was the daughter of Rubin de Celis, but she had never met him. She was born a few weeks after that sword pierced his heart. And across from me was the rebel general that Trinidad eventually married at the age of 16. And the rebel general's name was Pedro Cisneros Torres. He fought, he charged down that hill in the Battle of Ayacucho, and with Bolivar's forces managed to free Peru from, and ended, by the way, with the Peruvian freedom, ended all of Spanish rule in Latin America. So I always felt, even though I was sitting there being punished for being bad, rebellion was really great. Throw over the old guys, throw over the yoke. And so I was been fascinated with Bolivar ever since. But Bolivar is a really towering figure, and I wanted to give you a sense of that by sort of reading at some of what I've written about who he is. By the time he, exactly 200 years ago, in 1813, by the time he began his admirable campaign, in which he was not known at all, he was beginning to be known in South America, but by the end of it, by the end of 1813, he was known in really around the world. In Washington, John Quincy Adams and James Monroe agonized over whether their fledgling nation, founded on principles of liberty and freedom, should support his struggle for independence. In London, hard-bitten veterans of England's war against Napoleon, mostly Irish, signed on to fight for Bolivar's cause. In Italy, the poet Lord Byron named his boat after Bolivar and dreamed of emigrating to Venezuela with his daughter. But there would be 5 more years of bloodshed before Spain was thrust from Latin American shores. I'm sorry, 14 more years. It was a 14-year war. I'm just reading in the middle of it, so it's the 5 years is wrong. But there were 14 years of war and of great bloodshed before Spain was thrust from Latin American shores. At the end of that savage and chastening war, one man would be credited for single-handedly conceiving, organizing, and leading the liberation of 6 nations, a population 1.5 times the size of North America, a landmass the size of modern Europe, the odds against which he fought, a formidable established world power, vast areas of untracked wilderness, the splintered loyalties of many races, would have proved daunting for the ablest of generals with strong armies at his command. But Bolivar had never been a soldier. He had no formal military training, yet with little more than will and a genius for leadership, he freed much of Spanish America and laid out his dream for a unified continent. Despite all of this, he was a highly imperfect man. He could be impulsive, headstrong, filled with contradictions. He spoke eloquently about justice, but he wasn't always able to mete it out in the chaos of revolution. His romantic life had a way of spilling into the public realm. He had trouble accepting criticism and had no patience for disagreements. He was singularly incapable of losing a game of cards. It's hardly surprising that over the years, Latin Americans have learned to accept human imperfections in their leaders. Bolivar taught them how. Now, as Bolivar's fame grew, he was compared to George Washington. He was called the George Washington of South America. And there were good reasons why. Both of them came from wealthy and influential families. Both were ardent defenders of freedom. Both were heroic in war, but apprehensive about marshaling the peace. And both resisted efforts to make them kings. Both claimed to want to return to private lives, but they were dragged into the public sphere of shaping governments. And both were accused, as we all know, of undue ambition. There, really, the similarities between George Washington and Simón Bolívar end. Bolívar's military action lasted twice as long as Washington's. The territory he covered was 7 times as large and spanned an astonishing geographic diversity, from crocodile-infested jungles to the snow-capped mountains of the Andes. Moreover, unlike Washington's war, Bolívar's could not have been won without the aid of Black and Indian troops. His success in rallying all the races to the patriot cause became the turning point in a war for independence. It's fair to say that he fought both a revolution and a civil war. But perhaps what really distinguishes both men, both Simón Bolívar and George Washington, can be seen most of all in their written work. Washington's words were measured, august, dignified, the product of a cautious and deliberate mind. Bolívar's speeches and correspondence, on the other hand, remind me much more of Thomas Jefferson. They were fiery and passionate and elegant and beautifully wrought. They represent some of the greatest writing in Latin America. Although much was produced in haste, on the battlefields and on the run, the prose is at once lyrical and stately, clever but historically grounded, electric but yet deeply wise. It's no exaggeration to say that Bolívar's revolution changed the Spanish language, for his words marked the dawn of a new literary age. The old dusty Castilian of his time, with its ornate flourishes and cumbersome locutions, in his remarkable voice and pen, became another language entirely, urgent, vibrant, and young. So you see, this was a man who represented for me, and if I wanted to build this edifice of explanation of who Latin Americans are, Bolívar was really it, because he represented the history that really defined the continent of South America. The revolution that he fought was so different, so in such contrast to the revolution that was fought here. He had to employ when he started, and it was a white man's war essentially, because he was a very rich man. He came from probably the richest family in Venezuela and one of the richest families in all of Latin America. He was a very, very wealthy man. His parents had, well, his family had been in Venezuela for, at that point, 200 years and or more. And they had accumulated wealth of cocoa plantations, indigo plantations, copper mines. They owned 12 properties in Caracas alone. It was a tremendously rich family, and it began as a kind of an aristocratic discontent with the colonial power that the Spanish held in South America. And people don't really realize this, but Spain was very, very assertive in making sure that its colonies had no contact with each other. They were like spokes of a wheel. You could not travel from from viceregal, one area of viceregal Latin America to another. You could not do commerce. You were prevented, as a colony of Spain, from doing any manufacturing at all. You were prevented from owning a mine. You were prevented from any kind of commerce whatsoever, and it was punishable by execution. So you see the whole business of, you can imagine, putting together a revolution in a place that is so isolated by its former colonial power was a very difficult thing. And this is what Bolivar came up against. It wasn't automatic that countries would welcome him to liberate them, even though they wanted to be liberated. It wasn't automatic that the races would all play a part in it. In fact, the races kept shifting. In the beginning, the blacks, on whom so much of the revolution depended, were aligning themselves with Spain because they knew what that meant. They didn't know what the revolution would bring, but feeling that they already knew the evil that existed in the colonial system, they could deal with that. But they didn't know what was coming with the white aristocrats of Latin America, and so they were very hesitant. It wasn't until Simón Bolívar, who had been exiled for the second time, or went into exile for the second time because the revolution kept failing, the republic, each republic that was set up, first by Francisco Miranda, who himself is a tremendously marvelous romantic story, fell apart. The Second Republic fell apart, and he found himself, Bolivar, in Haiti, welcomed by Alexander Pétion. Now, if you know the history of Haiti, what had happened in Haiti was they had had a very bloody revolution in which all the whites were either sent running or killed, slaughtered, en masse. And Alexander Pétion said to Bolivar, "You will never win this thing. You are going back now for the Third Republic. I will help you. I will give you ships. I will introduce you to all of these English commercial establishments and men who can help you. But you must promise me one thing, and that is your next time out." This was already 1815. "Your next time out, the moment you hit the shore in Venezuela from Haiti, you must liberate the slaves. You must end slavery." And Bolivar had thought about this for a long time because, in fact, with probably a greater moral instinct than the American founders of Jefferson or Washington, he couldn't imagine that that you could fight for liberty, that you could fight for freedom with slaves. in the country. He immediately understood what Pétion was saying, and in fact had already figured that out. He knew that he was going to have to reach out and get the indigenous and by at that point, 300 years into the colonial history, there was a huge mulatto and mestizo population, along with the blacks and the Indians. Great slave trade, obviously from the Atlantic slave trade. And he knew that he was going to have to engage those many races in order to win the revolution and to really, really get it going. It wasn't easy, you can imagine. There were lots of suspicions. There were lots of, at the time, every general wanted his own country, really. The fiefdoms were very difficult to fight for Bolivar. But there was a point at which, and it was a very daring point, and I'll tell you about it in a minute, at which the whole tide of history changed. And that was that he managed to engage enough of the mestizos and mulattos who lived in Caracas and out in the plains, who were the horsemen of the Apure, who were able at least to give him the impetus or the courage to think differently about how the revolution should be fought. And he had the very daring thought. This was in the middle of 1819, when already much blood had been spilled, and the revolution had grown so bloody that half the population of Venezuela had been killed in the process. Some towns had been completely wiped off the map. He had the thought, well, maybe I will cease to worry about Venezuela and hit the Spaniards in the heart by crossing the Andes and going to New Granada, which is now Colombia. It was a ridiculous thought. It was rainy season. They were on the plains of the Apure. He was looking at the Andes. The plains of the Apure are parched in the summertime and absolutely flooded in the rainy season. Whole rivers become seas. The plains become lakes, great lakes. And no one would have suspected that anybody would be so foolish as to take an army with the cattle and the women and the soldiers through this flooded plain and then over the snow-capped mountains of the Andes, which, you know, everybody knows. You are taking an army over peaks that are 18,000 feet high. It was a revolutionary thought, if I may make a pun, and nobody would suspect that he would attempt it. Why would you go to another country when you haven't even won liberation for your own? He kept it a secret. The soldiers did not know where they were going. They just knew that they were wading through the water, that they were, sometimes they're having to carry the women on their back. The cattle were expiring one after the other. And he got to the bottom, sort of the range that divides the Venezuelan part from the New Granadan part. And he finally explained what he wanted to do. The soldiers were for it. He took a battalion, an army of 2,500 people with women, with some of the officers had their wives, and with cattle and horses and whatnot, and with his printing press, because he carried his printing press everywhere he went. He really did feel that words were the greatest weapon. And he pulled it off. He went through the Páramo de Pispa, which is the highest point where the Spanish had no garrisons for miles. And he went over that Páramo de Pispa, and he came down the other side in tatters, you can imagine. There were so many who died. A third of the British expeditionary force died in the process. All the cattle were gone. Many of the horses did not make it. But the number of people who came down the other side of the mountain were terrified the Spaniards, and they were enough to actually send the viceroy sitting in Bogota running. He ran, he put on a grimy hat, he put on a poncho, and he left $1 million pesos on his desk, and he ran for cover. They were detonating, you can imagine, detonating all the ammunition so that he wouldn't get at it, so that Bolivar wouldn't get at it. And he rode into the capital, to Bogota, all by himself. And there are wonderful descriptions of that ride, which is the way that I start the book. It's a marvelous story. It's full of adventure. As I say, it's full of romance. I could talk about his mistress, his favorite mistress, Manuela Sáenz, about whom much is known, but not enough is written. She was a great beauty, fierce, had a, as we say in Spanish, no tenía pelo en la lengua, which is, she said whatever she wanted to say. She was very direct. She had opinions. She spoke up. She dressed like a man. She was like nothing Bolivar's generals had ever seen. Some adored her. Some despised her. But she was, at 3 times in his life, the person who saved him from assassinations. The stories are dramatic. They're absolutely hard to believe that something like this could happen. Completely cinematic, really, story of Bolivar sick in the palace in Bogota, and Manuela Sáenz is called. He sends a messenger to bring her because he's so sick, and everybody around him is sick as well. It's the most unguarded moment Bolivar had experienced in his whole career. He sends for Manuela Sáenz. She says, no, I'm too sick. And he sends another messenger and says, no, you have to come. I'm feeling terrible. I need your help. And she puts on her galoshes and goes through the rain and gets through the palace. And he's sitting in a tub trying to cool his fever because he's so ill. And she comes in and she reads to him, and eventually he gets up, goes to bed, falls into a great torpid sleep. She does as well. And suddenly she awakes with the barking of dogs. And it is a whole organized assassination of 150 people who have converged on the palace to kill Bolivar. At this point, he is quite famous. He is quite powerful. Some of his generals, and certainly his vice president, are very suspicious of his power. And he says, what do we do? And she said, he doesn't have a pair of boots. His boots have gone out for cleaning. He's got a sword. He's got a pistol. And he says, well, I'll just go open the door, because someone is banging at the door at that point. And she said, no, get dressed. He gets dressed. She says, put on my galoshes and jump through the window. He puts on his mistress's galoshes, jumps through the window. He had just said to a friend a couple of days before, that would be a great getaway. As it happens, there are no guards outside, so he's able to jump. Manuela Sáenz goes to the door, flings it open. There she is, the general who on the other side, several soldiers on the other side, describe her as this beautiful sort of apparition with a sword in her hand and a hand on a hip and saying, what do you want? And of course, the story goes on from there. I'll let you read it for yourselves. It's quite amazing at every level. But so you can see my excitement as someone thinking, how do you explain the Latin American personality, the Latin American character to a North American reader? You explain it by showing how different the colonial system was, how much history, and in this case it's 6 republics that emerged after the revolution. And you describe it by this sort of insane kind of palatial, the palace life that Bolivar lived, and how it changed from country to country as he progressed from Venezuela to New Granada to Ecuador, liberating Panama on the way, down to Peru, which was the hardest of all, the hardest nut to crack. I hope you'll enjoy reading it. I want to hear your questions. And this is, I hope you'll have many questions for me, because this is always, for me, my favorite part. Thank you. Yes.
That was a great speech. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I came out here to buy the book, number one, because I read 5 or 6 fabulous reviews of it. I didn't realize you had an in-house reviewer, John, over there. He writes, I read him every weekend, but this was superb, and I can't wait to look at the book. I'm also lived half my life in South America. Knew a lot about Bolivar, but I've learned just from listening to you a number of things, including that his wonderful stuff in Colombia and the Battle of Ayacucho. We hear a lot, and it irritates me as somebody who loves this hemisphere, to hear about the late departed, His Excellency, the President of Venezuela, who uses Simón Bolívar as a tool to badly govern a wonderful people and a wonderful country. To what extent, since Bolívar lived a long time in Venezuela, to what extent was Chavez distorting history and just doing the usual crap that he did for 14 years? Or is there a serious historical responsible basis for using Bolivar as part of the Venezuelan package?
Thank you for that question. It's a very good question. There is very little, I speak about this in the epilogue of the book, there is really very little to compare with Hugo Chavez and Simón Bolívar, except for the thing that everybody since Bolívar died, and he died absolutely destitute, penniless. He had given up all his riches. And Hugo Chavez, by the way, died a very rich man. Opposite experiences there, but Bolivar was he was. Let me put it in the most concrete ways. Bolivar knew that he was a liberal. He knew that he was a man of the Enlightenment, and he was cast by his enemies as being anti-liberal. It's a mistake. He was not anti-liberal. He was one of the most liberal, enlightened leaders in the Western Hemisphere. But through the years after he died, and he died completely rejected by his own homeland and on the way to exile, it didn't take 10, 15 years before he was brought back as the great hero. His greatest general, well, I should say his closest general, Daniel Florencio O'Leary, said of him, Irish, whom Bolivar loved, said of him, there's something about Bolivar, it's the magic of his prestige. Well, there were at least 2 presidents before Hugo Chavez who did exactly what Hugo Chavez did. Take Bolivar's legacy and use it as their own. It's amazing to see people on the right use him, people on the left use him. For Hugo Chavez, who I think Bolivar would have been horrified to see how his name has been used in the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. But, it's been used many times before. He's constantly being brought out by leaders throughout Latin America to argue different points, which is why people are very, very confused about just who Bolivar was and just what he believed in. What Hugo Chavez and Simón Bolívar do have in common is this. Bolivar dreamed of unifying all of Latin America. He wanted a unified America because he felt it would be stronger, more influential, a greater, shall we say, counterpoint to the United States, which was growing very strong. Hugo Chavez, too, has a dream, and he has, the Bolivarian nations now, which are Ecuador and as you know, Bolivia and Cuba. They all call themselves the Bolivarian nations that have very little to do with actual Bolivarism. But thank you for the question.
Thank you.
Yes.
Hi.
Hi.
A two-part question as a bicultural person. One, could you enumerate several other what you would consider to be gross misconceptions about Bolivar on the part of North Americans, how we misperceive his legacy and how we misperceive him? And secondly, any truth to the story I've heard about the locket with George Washington's hair?
Yes. Let me start with that first. George Washington Parke Custis, who is the grandson of, or grandnephew, really, of Washington, wanted to send a medallion with a clipping of George Washington's hair inside to Bolivar because he felt that George Washington himself would have wanted to be associated with Simón Bolívar's name. And it was Lafayette, actually, who said to Custis, of all the people in the world that George Washington most admired, it was Simón Bolívar. And Marquis de Lafayette said that himself. And so the medallion was sent down. It was, for Bolívar, the absolute pinnacle of achievement. He admired Washington, he admired Jefferson, he admired the North American founders, although he knew that his task was very different and that he could not emulate them. But he treasured this medallion for all time. And actually, it's still in Venezuela. It's very much on display. And if you go down to Caracas, you can see it. The question about biculturalism. The question is misconceptions. Yeah, Bolivar was his whole life was lived with people having misconceptions about him. When he was fighting for the liberation of Peru and he was wending his way back to his homeland, there were rumors that he wanted to make himself king. And these were rumors that were put forward by his enemies, put forward by his friends, put forward by everybody. And it was a way of tarnishing his name. And he was the furthest thing from wanting to be king, in fact, because when he met San Martin, when Bolivar met the other liberator coming from the south, from Argentina and Chile, and they met in Guayaquil, the one thing that really, really turned Bolivar against San Martin was the fact that San Martin really believed that South America should have a king, that Peru should have a king. And he had actually sent people out to Europe to find a king to come and rule in Peru. And Bolivar said, no, I'm sorry, but we've sacrificed a lot of lives precisely to get rid of kings. So there are misconceptions there as well. And, they were used against him even by South Americans. So I'm not surprised that there are misconceptions about him from North Americans. Thank you for your question.
Hi. Well, like yourself, I grew up here, but I'm from Guatemala, and I have to confess I know very little about Simón Bolívar, and I'm looking forward to the reading. But as a son of a wealthy family, Was he educated in Spain? Was he, yes?
It's a great story. Yeah. It-
Because I have to believe that if he was educated abroad, coming from a wealthy family, he must have at some point learned something about history. And then, of course, because his traversing the Alps or the Andes is similar to Hannibal's
Right.
going over the Alps to sack Rome.
right.
So-
Except Hannibal prepared for 2 years, and Simon just did it.
Thank you.
Right. Thank you. The thing that's amazing about Bolivar's education, he was an inordinately erudite man. He could speak, languages. He read Rousseau in French. He read Cicero in Latin. He was educated because when he went to Spain as a very young man, he was sent over at the age of 16. Why? Because his mother's family, he was a complete orphan by this time. His mother was dead, his father was dead, and he was sent over by his family to see if he could persuade Spain to actually give him a baronetcy or, some noble position. And he ended up in under the tutelage of a wonderful Venezuelan who had lived in Spain for a long time, the Marquis de Ustaris, who brought him in. He had never had a son. Bolivar was an orphan. He brought him in, taught him everything, had tutors come in, and Bolivar ended up really astonished by his own interest in history and literature and music. And he was trained in everything from Ustaris's personal library, and also from the tutors, simply the people who came in. He was really, as I say, a person who changed the Latin American language because he had listened to the European philosophers of the time. He had read deeply. He appreciated good prose. He was a deeply educated man.
Since you may have already answered my question, I'm
Okay.
going to revise it into something of a filibuster, for which I apologize.
No.
But why did Bolivar refuse to work with San Martin? And of course, San Martin had offered to serve under Bolivar and certainly was a hugely talented military commander. His crossing the Andes was much more successful than Bolivar's.
Yes.
For example.
San Martin also crossed the Andes. He crossed the Andes, yes, in his and San Martin had something very similar to Bolivar also, which was that he too wanted to unite America. What happened in the process was San Martin was very sick in the process. He was, by the time he reached Peru, he was already very much of an opium addict. He had terrible arthritis. He had been a soldier since he was 12. He had terrible arthritis over the years. He was carried on a litter, really, over the Andes. But when they actually sat down and met in Guayaquil for the first time, and San Martin was trying to say, come help me with Peru. And Bolivar was not convinced that he wanted to help this man. The meeting was very awkward. The meeting was, it's very famous. Nobody was in the room to record it, but as years went on, there was enough that was written about it by both sides that we know pretty much what went on. But San Martin wanted Bolivar to come, and he even said, I will serve under you. And Bolivar knew that that was exactly what he didn't want, because the person who serves under you will have a greater prestige than the person who is actually ruling. So he said, no, that's impossible. And when San
Elaborate on
Martin...
that point? I don't understand that point.
Well, Bolivar actually writes that in a letter. He said, San Martin wanted to serve under me, and I knew that that would be a mistake, because he would have the moral advantage of having surrendered himself to me. So Bolivar refused really to help him very much. He said, I'll send you a few battalions. But San Martin at that point left Guayaquil knowing that in order for Peru to be free, for Bolivar to come and actually bring his liberating army, he would have to make himself scarce, which is exactly what he did. He left Lima in the middle of the night. He took a boat and went to Ancon, waited there a little while to see if he would be called back, and then eventually went down to Mendoza, Argentina, and then went into exile in France. But it's one of those great moments in history when you have two liberators sitting in the same room and really vying for authority. Thank you.
What happened to slavery in the 6 republics? Did they take the Haitian advice and end slavery?
Immediately,
Oh, they
yes,
did. Very good.
immediately. Although it was a lot of it was immediate in word and not in actual act. It was very, very hard for some people to let go of their slaves. But you have to imagine the revolution when the slaves are actually the slaves have been freed. They've been told that if they join the army, they will gain their freedom immediately. And it's so interesting to me that so few Latin Americans, and I've come across this, don't realize that it was really the black forces and the Indian forces that won our revolutions down there. You know, and I've had a great poet say to me, "How can you speak such rubbish?" You know, it was all those white aristocrats who were leading, but no, it was battalion after battalion of blacks and mestizos and mulattos and Indians who actually won the freedom against Spain, and Bolivar was very aware of that.
Thank you. Oh, and can I ask, was there any chance of a united South America?
You know, he tried in 1926. He held what they call the precursor to the OAS, which was he tried to call a conference of all these republics. He called it the Pan American Union, and he had written a whole sort of vision for this greater America, and people didn't come. They stalled. People died on the way. There were too many animosities. First, he didn't want to invite the United States. Then, his vice president invited the United States. And there was a kind of it became, as he said, that's when he said, this revolution has plowed the sea, because he couldn't really move what he really wanted to move, which was the unification of all of Latin America.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Be very brief. I just would like you to add a footnote to your answer about the education of Bolivar by including Andrés Bello in your...
Andrés Bello absolutely was one of his early tutors.
Right.
Yes, and he was tutored by a number of people in Venezuela. Andrés Bello was one of the great literary figures of Latin America, and he happened to be not too much older than Bolivar, and he was brought in as a tutor.
And he created Chile, for all I know.
Exactly. Thank you for that.
You mentioned one gentleman who's always interesting for me, and that's O'Leary.
Oh,
Would
yes.
you mind just talk a little bit about the person, who he was, and what influence he had on Bolivar? And then, if I could push you a little, second question, but it might give you an idea for your next book or your second one. This lady, Sáenz, right, his
Sáenz.
mistress, is there any correspondence between her and, say, Madame Lynch, who also was Irish, in Paraguay? And in the broader framework in which you obviously write and operate, the emergence of the female in 19th century Latin America as a political leader or as an influence on the male leaders.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. First, Daniel O'Leary, when the Napoleonic Wars were drawing to a close and you had a militarized Europe, you had a lot of soldiers who came back to England and Ireland and had no means of income. And it was these people who were recruited. And some of them came, they named whatever type. The recruitment was really very loose. It was done by someone who really didn't know much about soldiering, Venezuelan diplomat, who sat in London and just was recruiting like mad. And so people would come and they'd say, "Oh, yes, I was, a colonel, lieutenant colonel." And in fact, he was just, a scrub. But they would come over, and they were outfitted in these majestic uniforms, and they were taught all over London. and they were given, big champagne goodbyes, and off they would come to this absolutely wild revolution where, the soldiers were barefoot and they were fighting with spears and they were fighting with sticks. And they were ludicrous, parading around in these fancy, sort of European thing, and they could barely lumber along with all the heavy equipment that they were carrying. Daniel O'Leary was one of those, and he was very, very young. And Bolivar identified him very early and made him a general very quickly. And Daniel O'Leary was really not only one of his best generals, but one of his closest friends in whom he confided. Bolivar really liked having, I don't know where it came from, I can't explain it, but he liked having English and Irish assistants and generals around him. His little tight force of the people who were his secretaries and his assistants were almost entirely English and Irish, and he liked that. I mean, he had spent time in London, and he appreciated, I think, their experience in Europe in the Napoleonic Wars, and he elevated them. And Daniel O'Leary was certainly rewarded him by collecting all of his letters. If you go and 32 volumes of letters and correspondence and speeches, it was Daniel Florencio O'Leary who did it all, who collected it all, annotated it all. It was quite a gift back to Simón Bolívar. Anybody else? Yes. Oh, what I was doing? Oh, general sort of obstreperous behavior, Don. I was a pretty cheeky kid, and I fancied myself, a tomboy, and I didn't have pelos en mi lengua tampoco, so which means no hair on my tongue. I would say things I shouldn't have, and they made me the sort of prim little woman you see up here today. Thank you.
One more question about the Irish, if I may, plus
Yes.
one about a slightly different aspect of what you've talked about. Could you comment on what was going on in Chile and the role of the Irishman O'Higgins and his role in the Latin American Revolution?
Of course, Bernardo O'Higgins, who was the illegitimate son of the Viceroy O'Higgins of Chile, was one of San Martin's closest collaborators. And Bernardo O'Higgins' story is fantastic. I mean, somebody should write that in marvelous sort of romantic fashion. Bernardo O'Higgins corresponded with Bolivar. They didn't really have too much in common, but I think Bolivar knew that he owed people like San Martin and O'Higgins that part of that liberation of that part of the continent, and was very respected O'Higgins very, very much.
A final question, if I may. The United States had a number of agents in Latin America while all this was going on.
Yes.
There was correspondence
Yes.
between those agents and our Secretary of State and our President. Could you comment on the extent to which that correspondence contributed to misconceptions on the part of North Americans?
Absolutely, absolutely. Bolivar was in the middle of a very rough campaign. He was not only, he was, if I may say, suffering from hemorrhoids, from carbuncles, from any number of things while he was doing these 75,000 miles on horseback. And into this moment of when he's trying to tame the plains, in the plains of Venezuela, the tremendous force, a huge expeditionary force under Monteverde, the Spaniards who were fighting to keep their grip on the colony. In come these American agents, and one of whom, most famously, was a reporter who came down and was sort of freelancing information back to the president and his cabinet. And he was not treated very well. Because you can imagine, this is somebody coming with a scribbling pad in the middle of a revolution. He was not treated very well. The reports that he sent back to Washington were scathing, absolutely scathing. This little upstart, this, man with Napoleonic ambitions, and you couldn't say anything worse to an American than a man with Napoleonic ambitions. And so it was really through this kind of reporting back that Bolivar began to have a very, very negative reputation in the United States. Also remember that in the United States, slavery was the biggest commerce afoot. We're talking about 1815 and forward. Slavery was one of the Gordon Wood describes this very, very well in his Empire of Liberty. It was our GNP up here. Slavery was huge commerce. And the worst thing that Washington could imagine, I'm talking about Washington as the governing city, capital, could imagine, was actually supporting anybody who had liberated slaves and was using them to fight a revolution. This was just anathema. So it was very. The reputation began to get worse and worse in the United States because every slander, I think, was used against Bolivar, including the fact that a lot of people were dying in this revolution. It was a very bloody revolution. It didn't speak well for the whole enterprise. Thank you.
Thank you.